my charge is to draw a really bright line between federal spending, the Michigan budget, and hopefully bring it home as much as I possibly can right here to Lansing. And I am aided today by good, intrepid folks among you. So I want to say thank you to Frank, Chuck, Ella, Elena, Gregory, and Reagan, who are going to do a bit of the storytelling for us today about this budget. And so they'll stand up when they're cued and talk to you about the impact of federal spending on Michigan, on Lansing, or Ingham County. So I'm going to start from sort of a little bit of a bird's eye view. I'm going to look at a couple of years of the income taxes that you paid from Michigan to the federal government and what you got back. And then I'm going to talk just again about the year 2009. It's the last year that we can actually know the real amounts in dollar figures about what came home to your county, to the county of Ingham County. So I'm going to do that. And then I'll talk briefly about the 2011 budget and the projected impact. And I'll close with the 2012 budget, which, as you know, was introduced February 14. And it too, like the 11 budget, will have a profound impact. And it too has caps and cuts that will have really lasting impact. Okay, so Michigan, like every other state in the Union, you folks pay federal income taxes. Those federal income taxes, not the payroll taxes as Ruth delineated, those federal income taxes go to Washington, D.C., and in return, you get federal money. And it comes in the form of grants, loans, it comes in the form of individual payments. So in 2006, Michigan taxpayers contributed $70 billion in tax to help fund our nation's government. And the government returned $67 billion in the form of goods and services and payments. So you gave 70, you got back 67. It's never a static number, it changes every year. In 2009, now you remember this is where we are in the recession, right? The recession is upon us. You pay $74 billion, so it's less. You pay $56 billion, so it's less, thank you, I'm sorry. You pay $56 billion, it's less than 70, right? You, like very many other people in the nation, are able to earn less. There are more of us unemployed. Our wages, we're underemployed, our wages are reduced. We're able to pay fewer federal dollars back in the form of income taxes. You pay 56, you get back 74. So 70, 67 in 2009, 56, 74. And that, of course, was the impact of stimulus, the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, or stimulus. And also happening in 2009, of course, was the Troubled Asset Relief Program, or TARP, or the bank bailout. But the stimulus money was what we saw really in our local communities. So in 2009, Michigan, like most states in the Union, there were only two that were saved from this at that point. You were experiencing federal fiscal deficit. You were having a gap between what you were able to bring in and what you were able to provide in the form of services, and you had to do some things because states operate differently than the federal government. So folks often ask at NPP, why can't Michigan or North Dakota, well, it's actually not North Dakota, Hawaii or Florida or Connecticut, why can't they borrow to take care of their own needs? Why do we need a federal government? Well, because by and large, Michigan and many other states are prevented from borrowing, right? Every state operates differently, but there are balanced budget clauses. So states do really creative things. They have lotteries, they raise revenues other ways, they raise their own state income taxes, but they can't expand like a federal budget can expand by law. So the state has to either cut programs or generate more revenue. So Frank, in 2009, how did the federal dollars come home to Ingham County?
Joe, in 2009, Michigan received $4.6 billion in Social Security disability funding. Ingham County received $132 million.
So Ingham County got $132 million in 2009. Thank you, Frank, for Social Security disability. And Chuck, what was the impact on the programs dedicated to young people and students?
In 2009, Michigan received $9 million in Upward Bound funding. Ingham County got $424,214. Also in 2009, Michigan received $781 million in Pell Grant funding. Ingham County got $59 million.
$59 million in Pell Grant money coming home right to Ingham County, not to Michigan, but to Ingham County. And that's the work of your federal income tax dollars. And that's how we connect to federal spending at this very local level. So that was 2009. Again, the most recent data available for me to tell you what you paid and what you got back, and the impact of stimulus at that time. So what's happening today in Michigan? Well, Michigan's not very much different, again, in very many states. Your state revenues are still down, right? Below pre-recession levels. The costs here continue to rise as more kids need to go to public school, as more people need health care, as more of us need some social services in our midst. And we heard great responders. I was able to get here for the responders at the first part. And that was amazing, the stories, the testimonies that are happening right here. And federal aid is drying up. So after increasing from the first batch of stimulus from 31 billion, it went up to 68 billion in 10, and then 59 billion in 11, and by 2012, fiscal year 2012, which will start October 1, we'll be down to 6 billion in stimulus. So the federal aid, the stimulus, the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act program is drying up. And the fourth reality that's happening is that federal lawmakers, as we began to talk about, are considering both budget cuts and budget caps to the piece of the federal budget pie that is really called now non-security discretionary spending or discretionary spending. It's the kind of spending you and I know as the funding here in Lansing for education, healthcare, human services, law enforcement, infrastructure, and more. And we see a great deal of federal dollars come directly from the federal government into local communities. And yet it represents a really tiny percentage of the overall budget pie. It's only 12% of the entire budget, this little sliver of what is now called non-security discretionary spending. And there's an irony, of course, to that title given by the Obama administration. And it's 12%. So let's talk about the proposed cuts in the current budget crisis. So forgive me if I'm duplicating. So there's this continuing resolution, which you've talked about, and we're in our 5th iteration of it. And there are proposed cuts of upwards of $60 billion in something called HR 1. And now there are more cuts being talked about from the Senate side and the Obama administration that are beginning to talk about $10 billion, $11 billion, $12 billion. And there's going to be more talk about meeting somewhere in the middle. So these are many, many billions of dollars being talked about. But let's just talk about HR 1. So Elena, if HR 1 passes, or some version close to HR 1 passes, what would it mean for Michigan?
If House Resolution 1 passes, it would cut $40.6 million in funding for education for the disadvantaged and $30.4 million in funding for school improvement to Michigan. In real terms, education for the disadvantaged means Title I funding for schools in low-income communities, adult literacy programs, and more. School improvement funds are dedicated to programs like 21st Century Learning Centers, which provide academic opportunities to students of low income after school hours to improve performance.
Thank you. And Ella, what would happen to Pell Grants?
HR 1 would cut Michigan funding for Pell Grants by $202 million, affecting upwards of 337,000 students.
Thank you. A cut of $202 million, 337,000 students in Michigan affected. Thank you, Ella. And Elena, again, what's happening, what's the projected impact on public housing?
In terms of public housing, HR 1 would cut nearly $24 million in funding to Michigan dedicated to low-income or public housing. The Public Housing Capital Fund, which helps local housing agencies make repairs to low-income housing stock, would lose $18.8 million. And the Home Investment Partnership Program would lose $4.9 million. The HOME program provides states and local communities with block grant funding for rental assistance and the acquisition and rehabilitation of affordable housing stock.
Thank you. So significant impact on the low-income housing stock available and or the money to rehabilitate it. Okay, so mindful that October 1, 2011 is fast approaching, and that's the first day, technically the first day, of course that didn't happen for us this year, of the next fiscal year, of fiscal year 2012. Let's now take a look at the impact of the President's budget for fiscal year 2012 on Michigan. So states like Michigan and cities like Lansing are actually already counting their $12. Michigan is projected to receive $1.6 billion in school aid, and that's school aid funds for public education. And that, of course, would add to the much larger pot already contributed by the state, although I know there's hope that that pot would grow. But $1.6 billion from the federal government. And if I understand your city budget correctly, you're looking for $2.1 million in CDBG funding, that's Community Development Block Grant funding, and perhaps a $17.4 million three-year Housing and Urban Development grant, and that would demolish vacant and foreclosed homes and allow the rebuilding of those homes. So millions of dollars projected through this blueprint of our values in 2012. And that, after the 11 budget, that's the first thing that the government will take up, this 2012 budget. But it all hangs in the balance because we haven't yet begun to debate it. So when the Obama administration introduced the $3.7 trillion budget on February 14th, that's what's at stake, $3.7 trillion for 2012, he also acknowledged that there were hundreds, literally hundreds and hundreds of programs coming into states like Michigan. And he was wrestling with the impact of some of his decisions. So, for example, one of the things that Congress is going to consider is health and human service funding in 2012. So, Chuck, what's in store for Head Start and the Low-Income Home Energy Assistance Program, or LIHEAP?
In the 2012 budget, Michigan is projected to receive $273.3 million for Head Start. That's an increase of 10.3%. Michigan's funding for the Low-Income Home Energy Assistance Program, or LIHEAP, is projected to be cut by nearly 53%.
Thank you. Now, so 10.3% more in Head Start funding, that's good, but it's not enough, because the gap that Michigan has between the number of kids who need Head Start and the number of kids you're actually able to afford is 100%. You have a 100% gap from where we sit and we look at these numbers. That's enormous. And 10.3% increase is not going to do anything to close that gap, or not nearly enough. And then the LIHEAP, the Low-Income Home Energy Assistance Program, a cut by 53% is actually 3% less than the average cut, which is about 56%, but still enormous, and will have enormous impact. Reagan, what about Section 8 and the Community Development Block Grants?
The Transportation, Housing, and Urban Development Appropriations Committee will look at the projected $47.2 billion in HUD-related spending for 2012. For Michigan, this translates into $361 million in Section 8 money, 4.3% increase, and $131 million in CDBG funding, a projected 31% cut.
Thank you. And that's the Community Development Block Grant. That's what a lot of cities use in terms of funds available to make capital improvements. And that's projecting a 31% cut. Okay. So, in short, within the 12 budget, there are some winners and there are a whole lot of losers. And the majority of those losers again, are classified in something now emerging called the non-security discretionary spending. And President Obama has not only decided to cut some of those programs, but he's also issuing a 5-year cap. So he's basically said we're going to take the programs down to a lower level, and then we're going to leave them there. And we're going to leave them there for 5 years, which will mean that as inflation picks up, right, if our economy rebounds and inflation picks up, the value of the dollars funding those programs will erode. So it's tantamount to a cut. And he does this in the name of debt and deficit reduction. And absolutely our nation, as Ruth pointed out in a really great exercise, has to deal with debt and deficit. But let's be mindful of 4 things as I close. So while the Obama administration considers cuts in this five-year cap, the Department of Defense baseline budget will not only keep pace with inflation, it is projected to grow. It's growing every year until 2016. That's the base budget. That's not the ancillary budget. And while the Obama administration wants to realize this $400 billion in savings over a 10-year cap, so he's only projecting to cut them for 5, but he says if we cap them for 10, we would get $400 billion. There is, as Ruth said, studies out there like the Sustainable Defense Task Force that found $960 billion over the same period of time in cuts to our military that would still leave us as secure as we are now. And it's important to realize that even as we're thinking about $400 billion over a decade, 1 year of military spending, as Ruth said, is upwards of $1 trillion. But even if you don't count the stuff on the margins and you really just count war, nuclear weapons, and the baseline budget, it's over $700 billion. So that's significant in comparison. And finally, the numbers tell us plainly when we look at them that the story of our nation's federal spending is not the story of an unbridled checkbook, right? We see mandatory spending expand, and we see income tax decline, but we also have to take into account the effect of the declining corporate tax rate. Corporations will pay 8 times less than we will in 2012 in terms of the projected revenues. And we have to take into effect the continuing tax breaks for the wealthiest Americans. And Gregory, how much will the projected 2000 tax breaks for the wealthiest 1% of Americans increase our federal deficit in 2012? $42 billion. Just for 2012, friends. So, MPP is known for our trade-offs, so I'm just going to close with two. Lansing taxpayers, that's you, the folks who live in Lansing, you're going to spend approximately $26.7 million of your federal income tax to fund the U.S. wars in You're going to spend approximately, perhaps I'm overcome by this number, approximately $26.7 million of your federal income taxes to fund the U.S. war in Afghanistan just for this year alone. Again, $26 million just for this year, just for Afghanistan, just for Lansing. And Michigan taxpayers will contribute $2.9 billion for the same amount of time. So Michigan, with this money, $2.9 billion, your state could close the gap between the number of eligible children for Head Start and the number of eligible Head Start places. In fact, 1 year of the Afghanistan war would provide Head Start funding for all eligible children in the state for nearly 12 years. That's just 1 year of war spending just for Michigan. Or we can make another choice. We can close a corporate tax loophole that gives oil companies a tax break if they have to drill overseas. So they say, oh, I'm sorry, you have to drill overseas, you're an oil company, you're going to get $2.5 billion in tax breaks. Or we could keep LIHEAP, the Low-Income Home Energy Assistance Program, for the same amount of money. Thank you very much.